Welcome back, everybody, to DungeonBrew. John and I are continuing our conversation on Strongholds. Today we're talking about fighters. Stay tuned.
Welcome to DungeonBrew.
Welcome back, everybody, to DungeonBrew. Today, John and I are continuing our series on Strongholds, where we look at a stronghold from the perspective of a player, then the NPC, then the antagonist, getting into some of the layer actions that you may include in that as a GM. Today we're going to be talking about the fighter specifically. John, why don't you start us off by the type of stronghold we may consider when looking at fighters, though this is probably a little bit on the nose.
I feel like the obvious answer is a militaristic one, right? You end up with a fighter who ends up advancing up the ranks and, as a soldier, as a military man, that type of thing. And eventually they end up with some kind of fortress or keep or outpost or something that they can defend and that they have armies or troops or something like that. That is your typical fighter stronghold. But we've talked about other options kind of at a glance in some of the previous videos, but just to reiterate, you can definitely go a mercantile route. So you can end up with a fighter who decides that he's going to open up a tavern or a trading post or something like that. More interested in getting this is oftentimes associated with getting out of the military life, usually the retirement type thing, but there's no reason why a fighter couldn't have something like a tavern or an inn. You could also end up with a noble stronghold. So a fighter who has proven themselves. This is usually something like a knight, or a fighter who is in that noble lineage, who is advancing not only militarily but also in a noble sense. So maybe marrying into a noble family or having access to a noble estate in some way, gaining a title. Maybe they're an heir of some kind, and they're going to get access to their parent's estate or something like that. So those are definitely options. And then, as always with any stronghold, there's always a residence. So you can end up with some kind of villa, a sprawling estate where they have this grand house that they return to with their family that has got all kinds of water features and gardens and stuff like that, a place for them to relax and get reprieve before they go on their next adventure.
Yeah, and it may be some blend or mixture of these different elements too, depending on the real structure of it. I know, again, it's probably a little cliche for me to think about the strongholds for fighters specifically, but we did talk about like the location for druid strongholds and how important that is. Mm-hmm. When I do think of these strongholds for fighters, I immediately think of like their strategic position, their location, how it's set up to be a defensible place in terms of developing it. Now, I mean, when I think of things like maybe a bard or some of these other classes, it could be out in the open, it's friendly, it's jiving, people are coming in. You always want your stronghold to be defensible, but for a fighter, I oftentimes think about these strongholds that the player character is coming across as being a very strategic, defensible type of locale that's put together for the benefit of a greater nation or for themselves. And I really like what you're talking about here in terms of how the player character may be coming into gaining this stronghold. We've talked a lot about, maybe the party going and overtaking a particular area or a particular castle and then utilizing that as a stronghold. And that here, again, is an option, but you may have the fighter inheriting this from their family. It may be something that's interwoven into your story or into your plot that they come by it by a non-violent means of then acquiring that as a player character, maybe through a family or something along those lines, and now they have to defend it and uphold it and be a leader within that location.
Which is kind of a viable option, I think, for many of the strongholds we talk about is, it being some kind of thing that's passed down through generations. It also is something that you were talking about, like the location and the defensibleness of it. And I know that some of the options that I was pitching, like mercantile options or just a residence, I think for a fighter, especially a fighter who is building their own or creating their own stronghold, this is something that I think as a player, you want to consider that even if they're creating a home that is supposed to be not militaristic, that it's supposed to be removed in some kind of reprieve. There's not really a separation that exists at a certain point between the life of tactics and warfare and the actual residence that they build. And part of what I'm thinking is, like, you and I both have a background where we have, worked in dangerous environments, and you and I have talked about how it's like it's very difficult for us to walk into a room and not notice exits, not notice potential weapons and things like that could be used to harm us. So this is what I'm thinking about for fighters, is you walk into a room, or they start constructing their stronghold, and they're like, yeah, so I want to build this. I really want to build it there because that's the prettiest spot, but the best spot is actually to put it on that hilltop over there, because from there I have a vantage point where I can view the surrounding region, and if I do happen to have, old enemies who come and seek me out, I have a defensible location for my family. And I think that that's really important, at least from a player perspective, that you're keeping in mind that the fighter ultimately is a warrior and does not separate those things, even when he's trying to, or she's trying to, create a place of reprieve.
Yeah, and the items that you're including within this particular stronghold differ so much from some of the other classes that we have looked at so far, because they are more strategic and preparatory in nature. You're building a moat around the outside of the castle.
That may look like a water feature, right?
It's like, it may look like a water feature.
Beautiful pond. Why is it circular and surrounding the building? But it's a defensive thing.
and you're placing things in there like a barracks or a training grounds. You're putting in stuff like your armories and your war rooms and your watchtowers, siege workshops, things like that again are kind of building up the defense of this particular castle or stronghold or what have you, that isn't going to necessarily mirror something that we saw with a druid or a bard or a cleric. They're not going to go out of their way to necessarily build up the monastery or the church or the temple or the praying grounds or the shrine. They're going to be looking at these other features primarily to build first before they look at any other options.
Right. And on the other hand, we've talked about this before, which is that a particularly religious fighter can definitely include religious aspects or divine aspects or whatever for their stronghold. It makes sense that they would have a shrine to Kord or some kind of temple to Tyr if they consider that to be important as a part of their character choices. On the other hand, you also have archetypes like the Eldritch Knight, where it's like you're going to have maybe an arcane tower or a library or other functions within the stronghold that speak to the archetype of the class that you're putting together. So mixing and matching those things gives the fighter the versatility that is part of the blank slate that a fighter is, while also incorporating some of that versatility that you see in inherently versatile classes like the bard and the cleric and that type of thing.
Well, and when I think of fighters as well, which I know this is maybe a bit old school, I'm thinking 3.5 edition D&D, you have like your ranged options versus your melee options with the fighter, which might then take their stronghold in a particular location. Maybe you have a Fletcher as a mercantile option because the fighter primarily is ranged and he has a lot of archers at his disposal and that's what they're utilizing. Maybe it is a blacksmith you need to have within the stronghold because they're more of a melee fighter and they're building those close range weapons. Maybe they are primarily running cavalry. And so that then gives you a whole different feel of that stronghold when you walk into it, based on the primary maybe disposition of the fighter and the military he likes to run or the type of soldiers he likes to train. Yeah,
I like the idea of that it's like you walk into two fighter strongholds and they're fighter champions, like the blankest, slate type fighter, but one of them is one of them's an archer and one of them is a mounted cavalry style fighter. He's a knight. And they're completely different. Like, one has very high parapets where it's like it's ringed with archers and stuff like that, and the other one has a nice wide gate where it's like they can sally out with the cavalry and try and trample their enemies so that they aren't put under a siege. So the tactics involved in that may be different, and I think that's an interesting option.
And you can have a lot of fun too, even with just the weapon choices. Looking at different inspirations from across the world and the type of, spears, javelins, kopeshes, whatever the swords are that you're utilizing. All these things I think you can really have a lot of fun with. And also looking at resources. I mean, if you're building shields, are you near a forest to actually build shields? Or you having to build iron shields because you have a mine with way more iron than you need, but not enough wood. So again, it can have a lot of fun with that particular, that flavor that you're adding into the place.
So we've talked quite a bit about PC strongholds. Let's go into our NPC strongholds here for a little bit. And what considerations you have when constructing a stronghold for an NPC, a quest giver, somebody that the PCs are going to encounter in their adventuring career.
Yep. Again, I think that I oftentimes think of quest givers specifically in an NPC stronghold doing things that are going to be sending people out into battle, which maybe that again is just probably a little bit too much on the nose. But it's just I think if I'm going into a fighter stronghold, they are trying to withhold the natives, withhold the people that are uprising against them, keeping the peace, battling back adjacent nations. And so a lot of it is militaristic, strategic type of implementation. We have spies that are lingering all in the outer wood. We need you to go out and track them down and bring me their heads type of thing.
See, that's very interesting because I would almost flip the script on that and say you're going into a fighter stronghold. The fighter knows how to fight. He's like, I can handle the military. I'm doing this. I'm handling this. There are spies in my keep. I don't know how to root them out. I can't tell who's loyal. And so then you have a social style quest. You have something that speaks to the thieves and the rogues in the party that allow them to come in there and assist the lord in dealing with something that he's not equipped to deal with. Or have them go and handle things like, there's these weird fae out in the forest. We don't know how to deal with these, and my soldiers keep getting killed. That's, we need the ranger, we need the druid, we need somebody else to go help the lady of the castle because she's a warrior. She doesn't know what to do in this scenario. And I think that those are fun dynamics to play with where it's they have a certain skill set. They can handle what's within their wheelhouse. It's when you start getting outside of it that they need assistance in some way.
Yeah, I really like that idea, especially if you have a very blended, mixed party of individuals that are coming in and looking for work to do and bringing them into a place where they can essentially be a supplement to a fighter stronghold that's already in place. Yeah, That's a great idea.
Well, and the interesting thing is you're going to have some kind of fighter in the party. It may not be a straight fighter, but you're going to have some kind of fighter in the party, and then they're getting in good with an NPC quest giver who is a fighter and has connections. So then it's this is a lord or this is a lady. You have a noble NPC quest giver. And when that fighter archetype or that fighter type class decides that they want to create a stronghold, suddenly they're allowed to build a stronghold somewhere within that domain. I'm going to build a keep out here. I'm going to build this. I'm going to do that. And we've talked about this with the religious style strongholds where there's that interconnectivity. The same thing happens, and this is something that I'm doing in our current campaign where the fighter-style classes speak their own language. They speak legionary, right? They have that ability to have that jargon, that jarhead speak, where it's you can have a conversation that's on a different level because you are all people of war. You understand warfare, and there's that communication that exists. And I really like the idea that the classes within the system have some kind of connection that exists beyond, well, I'm a fighter, I'm a druid, I'm a whatever. There is a connection that exists, and that can happen easily if you're getting in good with an NPC fighter class style stronghold.
I will say that when I think of that fighter class stronghold, it's really difficult for me to conjure new concepts because I think that every time I think of a medieval stronghold, I probably default to a fighter stronghold.
Right.
It's probably what I see most often in films. It's what I see represented in gameplay. It really fits the medieval structure that I think that most players or gamers go to in D&D. So whenever you're developing this, I think it's just looking for nuance, ways to make it creative and interesting to kind of keep it as part of the story and just doesn't feel a generic place that you're walking into. I think that's the biggest challenge with this for any GM.
Yeah. So, I do want to just reiterate again, when we're talking about NPC strongholds, the goal behind an NPC stronghold is to help establish what a stronghold looks like for your players give them ideas of what it's going to be like when they get their own stronghold, and then allow them to create lasting connections so that they have somebody to petition to or engage with or get quests from to achieve a stronghold later on in the game. So it might be something where the leader of that actual stronghold dies and they inherit it for whatever reason, whether it's a family member or simply they're trusted because of the work that they've been doing. Or it's a situation where they decide they want to create a stronghold and they do it on that person's land, at which point maybe they petition for it, or they want to do it on a neighboring person's land or a wild land, but they're able to use that NPC quest giver as a means of getting to that location. So it's creating the story, it's creating that narrative thread early on in your game that allows your PCs to eventually get a stronghold later on in the game. And just kind of creating those connections early on helps you out in the long run, so then they have somebody to talk to.
Yeah, that is a great advice. So are you ready to shift into the antagonist then?
I think so.
Yeah, so with the antagonist stronghold, this is where you essentially have a place that is set up that the NPCs may need to be going into to overthrow whatever's being run there, maybe to utilize it as their own, or maybe it's just an enemy that they need to defeat. But looking at that fighter stronghold, I'll be honest, when I think of a fighter antagonist stronghold, the personality and the attitude of that NPC, I think, adds a lot of definition to what you're going to come across when you come in there. You're looking at the way that traps are being developed, what those defenses look like that they're having to make their way through. These challenges may be combative in nature, but they could also have this type of exploration type of things to overcome. Like, how are we going to get across the moat that has crocodiles without maybe killing the crocodiles, or that has the kraken without disturbing the water? Or how are we going to get over these tall castle walls because there's no particular way to open the doors. We have to find like this particular obstacle to overcome. So for me, it's what type the personality of that NPC and how that kind of is mirrored in the traps and the defenses that are set up in that stronghold for those PCs to overcome, to finally get to that big BEG at the end of the end of the quest.
So I really like what you're talking about when it comes to traps, because I think that this is something overlooked when it comes to fighter strongholds, because you think, I'm going to go into a thieves guild, there's going to be traps. But when you go into a fighter stronghold, there are. But the thing is that a fighter stronghold trap is not the same as a thief trap, because a fighter stronghold trap is something you can see. Like, they're not, it's not the subtlety of going, oh my gosh, these castle walls sprung up right in front of me. How did those come to be? You see the moat, you see the ring of spikes, or the pit of spikes that's surrounding it. You see the walls, you see the parapets, you see the arrow slits in the walls. Like, these are all things that are there and obvious to the PCs if they're paying any kind of attention. They're still traps, and they should be approached as traps. They're things that have to be overcome, and I really like the idea of that. And this is something that happened in, again, our recent game, where you guys were trying to go into the abandoned dwarven city, and you were going down the long hallway that had all of the arrow slits in the walls. They had holes in the ceilings that they were dropping boulders through. Some of these things were obvious to you. As you were walking down, you could see the arrow slits on the side of the walls. You could see enemies on the other side of them. You were not paying attention to the ceiling. You didn't notice that there were holes in the ceiling where they started dropping boulders on your head as you were trying to advance. Those things are still traps. They're just not really ones that can be disarmed or disabled. You have to get creative with how you approach those things. And for an antagonist stronghold, those things should definitely be a part of the construction from the DM side to create that challenge and create that interest for the players as they approach it. So it's not just walking in the front door and fighting enemies, because that's boring.
And if anyone has ever watched any medieval movie ever, every commander, every general that is laying siege to a stronghold knows there's going to be casualties and knows that there's those types of defenses they have to overcome. You know archers are going to be shooting arrows at you. You know hot oil is going to be thrown at you. You know there's going to be fire involved. You know that all these things are going to occur and people are going to be lost, and it's having the right number of people or the right strategy to get by it all with the least number of casualties or injuries as possible. And I think that's the challenge that you want to present to your players.
Right. So, I mean, the antagonist, again, this is most often, I think, you're talking about personality and the character of the antagonist that they're eventually going to be approaching. I've tried to emphasize this off and on through the various strongholds we've approached so far. Don't get locked into the antagonist is always evil. There are other reasons why an antagonist needs to be removed. It could be a situation where the antagonist actually thinks that they're doing good, but in reality they're not necessarily doing good, or they made a decision that they regret, but they're not willing to face the consequences of that decision, which allow for various resolutions to occur that aren't always trial by combat. And for a fighter, that might be somewhat anticlimactic, but I think that it's an interesting option. So Dragon Age Origins is a great game. I love playing it. But Loghain is definitely that fighter antagonist type. Yeah. And the way that you eventually approach him and resolve your conflict with him, you can actually recruit him potentially, which I think is very cool. So it's like if you play your cards right and you make the right decisions and you do the right things, instead of slaying Loghain and killing him, it's possible that Loghain becomes a member of your party for a short period before the end of the game. Throw those options in there. Make those things not necessarily always available, but make it to where you aren't closed to options that make gameplay more interesting. It would be really cool to defeat the antagonist in his own stronghold and then end up with them as an ally potentially.
It has been so long since I've played this game, so I hope that I'm not like giving away the plot with this idea, because I can't remember how you actually overthrow that. But if you guys are looking for like another option for what this may appear, the noble thread that we were talking about earlier is what comes to my mind. It's coming into a stronghold where maybe you have a brother that has taken the seat of a throne, and he is not the legitimate heir. And so you may have to go in and show him the documentation, convince him to step down because there's a son that's been born or somebody else that has been uncovered that is the legitimate heir, and having to essentially put him on the throne instead. And maybe that brother doesn't want to step down and you have to convince him. So there's like different aspects in that. Convince him with your fist, but there might have to be other things like that you could utilize. There could really be some interesting social gameplay interplay to unthrone somebody and take over that stronghold from that antagonist that isn't violent in nature.
Right. So all of those things being said, I mean, violence is a lot of fun at the end of the game when you're finally facing the BBEG. So having those lair actions available are definitely there. This is, again, we talked about the barbarian where it's like, oh, you can have the archers, you can have these other things as lair actions. It's entirely possible that you can have other options for the fighter that aren't necessarily that. He can call foot soldiers and not just archers. He can have additional things where it's like he is using his arrow slits, so maybe it's not archers up there. Maybe there are archers at the arrow slits that are firing across the room. He can also be using his warlord's call. He can be doing things where he gets something like an advanced second wind type ability that he can use as a lair action now and again to heal himself. Any of those viable options. I know that there's some really good abilities that I'm trying to think. I think that maybe is the Orc Chief in 5th edition that can cry out and all of his allies get to make a single attack as a reaction if they haven't used their reaction for the round. That type of stuff is really beneficial as well. But getting creative with lair actions is cool. And remember, those lair actions could be used by the PC potentially as well when they're defending their own stronghold if you're open to those options.
Another lair action that I would throw out there too, because I played way too much PlayStation 2 growing up, and I remember every time we used to play the BBEG, he would always have like these little cutscene things where he could like run to the top of his throne and then just like throw like 3 spears or some shit, and then pull out his sword and run back down into battle, and you're like, oh, here comes the spears, and it's like that little cutscene moment. But making sure that your fighter antagonist that you're going up against is skilled in multiple ways with multiple weapons, and maybe he switches out the weapons that he uses when his life gets to a certain point, or he goes to a different level of fighting, or he has again like that little cutscene where he's able to engage in additional actions in a turn for a short period of time and then come back again to the regular, which is, I think, as long as you're looking at your action economy and not overwhelming your characters, can be a lot of fun.
I'm not going to pin you on this, but do you remember what game you're talking about? Because I can see this in my brain, but I cannot remember what you're referring to.
I was having the same experience. I don't remember. Okay. I remember the scene. I can see it in my head where there's like, ah! And then he just runs up and does some shit. And then he comes back and you have to like go take cover as it's happening. I can see it, but I can't remember what game it is.
Fair enough. All right. So as far as fighter strongholds, again, a lot of versatility, a lot of options there. Get creative, not only with if you're a player, with how you're wanting to develop your own stronghold, but also as a DM when you're developing NPC and antagonist strongholds.
All right, well, I hope that you guys have enjoyed this conversation on Fighter Strongholds. It's been wonderful sitting down with you again. Make sure if you haven't hit subscribe that you do. Hit the little ding bell, and we'll talk to you guys next week.
Sounds good.
DungeonBrew.